So you've been making the podcast rounds, huh?
Yeah.
Been doing other podcasts.
Yeah.
I can smell them on you.
Okay, listen. It got a little out of hand. I understand that. I didn't mean for it to go as far as it did, okay? I tried to slow it down, but Nacho, they just kept talking to me and talking about, they bought me some drinks. We just had a good time.
Nacho, that salty organization stealing you away. So if people want to hear you on another podcast, what should they?
No, I don't.
No, you don't want to plug it.
No, I don't want to do it. I don't want to plug it. I want to stay where I am. I want to stay in this relationship that we're in right now.
All right, we'll see, man. I don't know.
I'd never leave you, Andrew.
Okay. We'll see, man. You get 1 strike.
Oh, I get 3 strikes? So you're saying I can do it again?
Sure. You got 2 more times.
All right, good. We are so excited about today. And we're excited for so many reasons. We got such great speakers. We're talking about such a great topic. It's all around, I think, going to be an exciting hour. We're excited to do it right now.
Yeah.
So we have 2 great folks here. They are the co-directors of the world-renowned Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware. First up, Dr. Tricia Wachtendorf. You have been doing quick response field work for a while now, since the World Trade Center. You guys have been doing research on that since that time. You've published on innovation in improvisation in disasters, disaster convergence, worked on, this is my favorite, the temporal nature of household decision-making, because in our house it takes us like 3 hours just to get out the door for work on a daily basis, and investigating humanitarian logistics. So many great projects. The Disaster Research Center has been doing so much good work.
With Dr. Jim Kendra, fellow North Texas Emergency Administration Planning alumni. We weren't there at the same time, but he was also there. He was the coordinator of the program. He's got research interest focused on the individual and organizational response to risk, improvisation, creativity during crisis, which is a huge part of the conversation we'll have today. He's done projects focusing on the EOC after the 9/11 attacks, the Waterborne Evacuation of Manhattan, research on social impacts of the Indian Ocean tsunami, and many other things. And this is actually a rare live podcast. We have them here in person.
That's right, in my basement. We brought him down in the basement. Trisha was like, "Is there a serial killer waiting for us down there?"
We're like, "Just go down to the basement."
And there still may be, guys. It might be that kind of a show. Lots of surprises heading your way. But welcome. We're so glad you guys were able to join us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. And you missed out the most important part there, that we also enjoy hanging out with cool people talking about disasters. So thanks so much for having us here, and we're looking forward to it.
I'm excited
because people are supposed to show up shortly, right?
Oh yeah, no, the cool people are on retainer. Any time now they're going to come in.
Or they're the serial killers.
Oh yeah, well, is that true? I mean, there's a whole research study we could do on that. Coolness and serial killers. No, yeah. I'm excited that it's the middle of the afternoon and we're still drinking beer, because
and you have our full attention as podcasters.
Yeah, that's right. Wow, where do we start?
I think we just jump in. I mean, the main point we're going to talk about is this wonderful book that you've written. Let me make sure I get the name right. American Dunkirk, the Waterborne Evacuation of Manhattan on 9/11. And this is a topic that I had heard about before. I knew it occurred, but I had not read much detail about it until going into this book. And it's just an incredible book. So I'd love to hear kind of off the bat, how did you get interested in this topic out of everything happening around that day? Why did you choose to focus on this particular subject?
Well, we had gone into New York City just a couple of days after the 9/11 attacks. We were both at the Disaster Research Center at that time, and like everybody, we saw those terrible events unfolding on television. And within a couple of days, we tried to get into the city, which is one of the Disaster Research Center's primary research methodologies, which is to get to a place as quickly as possible in order to see how the emergency response is unfolding and to be able to document what happens. And while we were there, among many of the things that we heard about, we heard bits and pieces about the evacuation, which was over by the time we arrived. But we heard about it, and it seemed like an incredible event. And before going to graduate school, I used to be a merchant marine officer. So the maritime aspect really resonated with me. And as we talked about it, it just seemed like something that, with our interest in improvisation, we wanted to follow up on.
And it was really such an inspirational story, which I'm sure that you found as well as you started getting into some of the accounts from the people who participated in the boat evacuation. So often when we think about disaster, we think about all the things that go wrong, all the failures, all the things that could be done better. And the remarkable thing, but not that remarkable, because we do see it in other events as well, the fact that so many things went well in addition, and that the boat evacuation was a great example of people coming together, of figuring it out on the fly, of coordination taking place, really an example of many of the things that we study, but also a very positive event or portion of the event to point to about how people can really survive and thrive in their disaster response.
So in this hour of Dukes of Hazzard, we're going to really dive into this. We're going to look at where it came from, the scale of it, the lessons for disaster management. And I just want to take a second here to set the scene. And there's nobody, I think, really to set the scene for an American tragedy like Tom Hanks.
On the morning of September 11th, when the towers came down, millions of people ran for safety. Hundreds of thousands of them ran south to the water's edge. That's when they realized that Manhattan is indeed an island, and that they were trapped.
They were feeling helpless, and that's the worst feeling in the world. What was a person on the ground going to do? Buildings were down. There were people laying under the rubble of the building. Firemen, civilians. My wife was there, and I turned around. I says, I've got to go do something. Just like that. And she looked at me. She says, what are you going to do, you maniac? I says, I'm going to take the amberjack up into the city and help. She says, but what if they're attacked again? I says, well, then that's something I have to live with. I says, I have to do what I have to do.
So, that's from a short documentary. It's on YouTube. It's called Boatlift. The other voice there, other than Mr. Hanks, was Vince Ardolino, who was a private boat captain that day. I wonder if you guys could just start by setting the scene. I forget even how long ago 9/11 has been now, how much the world has changed since then. And I talk to people and they reference it as a meme or a shorthand, but they don't actually understand the impacts of that day and sort of how it went down. So I wonder if you could frame the story for us.
And that's a good observation about the passage of time, because Tricia and I are both professors, and so we're starting to get to a place where our students, for them, 9/11 is a historical event. For those of us who are older, it's something that we saw and that was very immediate. But as time goes by, it's something that people understand and learn about only through classes or through retrospective accounts. I think what everybody on the East Coast anyway, who reflects back on that day, they think about the incredible clarity of the sky and the fabulous weather, that crystal clear blue, and then the surprise of one plane and then another striking those towers, and then their eventual collapses. And the Boatlift itself began really very early in the emergency. There were boat operators, ferry boat operators, who saw the first or second plane hit, and they turned around and didn't drop off their passengers in Manhattan, or others picked up passengers that they had just dropped off. And over the next half an hour, and then when the towers eventually collapsed, people who were evacuating ran in all directions, and anybody who ran south or west, they ended up stranded at the waterfront. And so in photographs you can see throngs and throngs of people who are stuck at the water's edge with no place to go. And
the person who you just played, who said that quote of I just did what I had to do, or I had to do something, that was something that we heard over and over again. And at first we were a little bit dismissive actually of it. Well, it had to be more than that. What was going on in your mind, what your decision making. And we heard it so often that I just did what I had to do. We hear a lot about the Coast Guard call for all available boats, and certainly there were some people who responded to that with their boats at the time. But a lot of people were either already underway, they had just dropped people off and turned around to pick them up. And I think, like many other areas around the city at the time, people saw a need. They wanted to do something. It gave them a sense of empowerment in a situation that was very frightening, very uncertain. And they started doing, and that really evolved into its own operation. I think one of the things that was also remarkable about the evacuation itself was all the other activities that sprung up around it. So you had buses that were coming together on the New Jersey shore or in Brooklyn to get people and to move them a little bit further in where they could be picked up. You had washdown stations popping up and people coming to provide assistance. Firefighters who were coming in to provide help, getting on the boats as they returned back. None of this was sort of thought out and planned, but people just started doing. And you had this remarkable response that emerged from it, like you did in so many other areas of Ground Zero in the city.
And that was a theme you hit several times in the book, I think, was people just saying, you know, I need to help, and I'm going to go help. And these weren't people necessarily trained in search and rescue or high-angle rescue or even CPR and first aid. They knew how to drive a boat, and they really understood the harbor. And they said, those are the skills I'm going to offer to this, and I'm going to go and help. And it really all came together. And so it's just a remarkable book of story after story of people just saying, I need to help, and coming together to do it.
And what's fascinating about some aspects of this from an emergency manager's perspective is how many of the boat operators said that when they got underway and they were driving toward Manhattan, that they didn't know what they were really going to do. And so I have a couple of quotations that I think really express that very, very poignantly. So one mariner said, "Hey, we don't know what we're going to see. We don't know what we're going to do, but we're going to go." And another one said, "We didn't know what we were going to do, but we had to go over there and do something. We didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but we figured we might need to evacuate." And so out of all of these boats, even though some of them knew that they were going to do evacuations, others didn't. But they knew that they had a particular range of skills. They had their boat operator skills. They knew each other. They knew the waterfront. They knew the harbor. And they were going to figure it out when they got there based on what they saw.
So I remember a long time ago when I was taking emergency management courses in school.
Many years, like decades and
decades of time. In a galaxy far, far away.
Mm-hmm.
Learning that you didn't want spontaneous volunteers. That as the government, you want that organized. So you keep people out, and then when you need volunteers, then you slowly let them come in. So in this case, pretty much the opposite happened. Why was it so successful in this situation, where in emergency management theory, at least back in the day, was that something you did not want to happen?
Well, I think one of the differences here, and again, not just strictly related to the boat evacuation, was that people were doing things that they had a knowledge of, that they had skills of. Yeah. You didn't have someone like me getting behind a boat and trying to think, oh, I'm going to evacuate people in this, I've never been behind a boat before, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know the harbor. These are people who had knowledge in their domains, and you have other people like teachers who are really good at working with children and calming them and organizing them. You have people who have skills in making phone calls and getting things done and calling a person to come in and provide supplies in a particular area. So it's not just people showing up and working in areas that they have no skills in, but people who are doing things within their capacity. But it's also important to remember that some things don't really require a lot of skills. Sometimes you just need someone to pick up a box and bring it from here to there, and then pick up another box and bring it from there to here. There's lots of ways that people can be involved in a way that actually bolsters the response, especially in these catastrophic events, and makes that successful. One of the things that we heard from I think it was the Coast Guard operator, who said, things were going well, I just let it happen, and you know what, I wouldn't have been able to stop it if I wanted to. Right. So that individual was keeping an eye on things, making sure things weren't going awry, but also understanding that that people have a role to play in their own response. We talk about a whole community approach. That's exactly what that is.
I wonder, just to humanize this, you guys do a great job in the book of going between sort of disaster lessons and large-scale logistics and then human stories. Are there any particular stories that really stood out at you about that day?
One thing I think that stood out to me, at least, because I as a mariner, I think I understood how they were balancing the risks that they felt that they were taking. Some of them knew that they were overloading the boats. For example, they were they were bringing passengers onto boats that weren't certified to carry passengers. So at the same time that they were doing all of these incredible things, they were also conscious of the fact that they wanted to measure the risks. And we had talked with a couple of them who were very very descriptive in how they were balancing the risks. So we interviewed one ferry boat captain who was driving into North Cove, and which is on the western side of Manhattan, and he was saying that the smoke and the ash and everything was so thick that he couldn't see, that he was driving in on radar alone, and he's thinking, wow, radar, don't fail me now. Yeah. And fiberglass and concrete don't mix. So he was balancing the risk, and he was concerned about that. Or we talked with another mariner who said that after a while, maybe it was 3 or 4 hours, that suddenly they sort of all caught their breath, and they thought, wait a minute, let's start slowing things down. Let's take it easy. Let's not make a thing worse than it has to be. So they kind of recognized the risk, and they managed that artfully.
One of the stories that comes to mind for me, and I'm a sociologist, so I gravitate to these sociology terms like identity, and how much the fact that they were mariners influenced what they chose to do. So there was one boat captain who had just dropped her daughter off at school. It was the primary elections that day, so she had gone out to another school to help out on that front. Eventually helped evacuate the school, had collected her daughter after the towers were hit, and made her way to Pier 63, where she knew people who owned the pier and were working that area, and thought, the only thing I can do is the boat thing. So she got her boat and started helping with the evacuation. And clearly there's so many other things that she could do besides the boat thing. She could hand out water, she could provide comfort, she could help with some logistical aspect. But the way we see ourselves in a response isn't that much different from the way we see ourselves every day. We identify a need based on that view, our identity, and really how much that influences where we see our role in a disaster. I was giving a talk up in Calgary last year, and one of the people who was in the audience came up and talked about a combine evacuation. So they had flooding up there, and how these large combines were used to evacuate people. Well, if you're a farmer and you have a large vehicle and you think you can evacuate people by combine, no one else is going to be thinking about that but you, right? You sort of see that need to be filled.
And this thinking you're describing is so sophisticated, right? They're balancing risks, they're making choices. It really is very different than the behavior people assume to have, the stereotypical behavior in a disaster where people are just running pell-mell around. The thing that was astounding to me, still thinking back at it, is the scale. I'm going to play just one more clip here to talk about that, which goes back to the kind of Coast Guard call out that you referenced a little while ago.
All available boats. This is the United States Coast Guard aboard the pilot boat New York. Anyone want to help with the evacuation of Lower Manhattan, report to Governor's Island.
When that call came on the radio, they were coming.
I was uncertain of who was going to respond. About 15, 20 minutes later, there are just boats all across the horizon.
Literally 100 targets converging on the lower part of Manhattan.
When we came out of that dust cloud, tugboats, I've never seen so many tugboats all at once.
There was just like a fleet of tugboats headed to Manhattan.
If it floated and it could get there, it got there.
Which leads me to the question, how big was this thing?
In terms of the number of people who were evacuated, The most credible estimates that we've been able to determine are from 300,000 to 500,000 people over the course of about 8 to 10 hours, with maybe 120 boats of different types that were involved. And these were boats that would, pick up evacuees in Manhattan and either take them uptown or take them up to Weehawken, take them across to Liberty Landing or down to Staten Island, and some of them either around to the eastern shore of Manhattan or over to Brooklyn. So just making repeated trips back and forth. Eventually, once they had started disembarking evacuees on the New Jersey side, they were bringing first responders back, or they were bringing water or other kinds of equipment, food and stuff. And the boatlift itself went on for several days, probably till about Friday, when things really wound down. The evacuation was pretty much over by Tuesday evening, but the supply boatlift went on for several more days.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and there were lots of other examples of things that these vessels did. So you had the John J. Harvey, which is a retired fireboat, the great New York example of a bunch of people getting together to salvage it and rescue it and restore it. And then turning it into its original usage to help pump water from the river to aid with the fire suppression activities. There were dinner cruise vessels that turned into respite centers. So clearly the dinner cruises were off at that point, but they had all this food on board. So you had first responders coming in and having a chance to sit down to get fed. Really a floating respite center. So lots of other uses that these vessels played in the response in addition to the evacuation.
I love the story of the fireboat captain who said, I'm going to misquote him, but it was basically, you can't get rid of this boat because at some point you're going to need it, and it's worth our time and effort to keep it operational, to keep the hoses going. And that came true, right? When they wanted to decommission that.
That's right. It had been retired several years before. It was built in the 1930s, if I remember right. It was had the highest pumping capacity of any fireboat, but it was thought that it had reached its functional life, and it was retired. And then a group of fireboat aficionados were able to buy it and restore it. And what we see from the Harvey is the example that disasters tend to refresh the importance of technologies that we think are old or outdated or obsolete, because the Harvey was from a distant era when breakbulk ships would come up to New York Harbor and they discharged their flammable cargoes onto wooden piers, and you needed this massive firefighting capacity to extinguish those fires. But that kind of commerce is long since past. It's been containerized. It's gone across to Elizabeth. But then, just on this day, the Harvey was there with just what was needed, which is the old-fashioned ability to just pump a lot of water.
While you were talking, I found this quote that you're probably referring to as well. So just that reputation of the vessel that they were very aware of. And one of them had said that got to have a little bit of hose, go buy a boat that's burning. It'd be really embarrassing not to have a little bit of hose. So thinking about, it's not what they're doing. They're generally going to these festivals and participating in a parade of boats and that kind of thing, having kind of historical tours, but always remembering that this is a fireboat and the sense of preparedness of the role that could be and the reputation of the vessel as a marine fireboat.
Yeah, and that sense of identity, like just as people, preserve their identities, like the tugboat captain, that we talked about a minute ago. The identity of the Harvey was as a fireboat, and this fire, the fire captain there wanted to preserve that identity.
Listening to this as an emergency manager, I have this big flashing liability light in my head, like safety liability, safety officers, liability concerns, lawsuits, but from your book, I think this is right. Nobody died during this evacuation. Is that true?
It's more or less correct. There were no significant vessel injuries. We were able to document one heart attack.
Yeah, where someone had captain, we believe, had a heart attack while performing the evacuation. So not directly related to aspect of the boat evacuation itself. And we heard a little bit about since the book came out, another injury that might have occurred, but thinking about 300,000 to 500,000 people being evacuated, quite remarkable. And it's important to remember too that they weren't turning a blind eye to safety.
Right, of course.
So even at the beginning, they were certainly overloading the boats more than they should have. But at some point, as Jim mentioned, they took a pause and said, we need to slow down here. Even during that process, they were putting people on tugboats that are certainly not designed to carry passengers in this way, sitting them down, having a safety briefing, giving them whatever life jackets they have, and really having an eye for safety in the process. So it was really the spirit of the rule. Why are you doing these things? You're doing it to ensure safety. That spirit of the rule maintained even if they deviated a little bit from what the actual official rule was.
And that really speaks to this idea that they were coming not just as random volunteers, but as volunteers with expertise. We were kind of in their world now, and they were able to sort of set the rules of what that world was going to be. And
I just say that then those who were the random volunteers had other roles to play.
Right,
that
absolutely.
didn't require them making those very difficult decisions that had safety contingent upon it.
As it went on, did it become more linked to the official response that was happening that day, or did it stay as kind of a separate entity?
Probably it had some amorphous links. So in some of the mariners that we talked to, they talked about going to planning meetings, for example, at Ground Zero, but they really weren't able to take away much out of those meetings.
Sure.
And I think that part of what made the effort successful is that they really weren't connecting with other kinds of operations, because as soon as you start trying to bring these different cadres of people together, then you start creating the need to coordinate. Then you start creating the need, the emergence of conflict. So what was successful about the evacuation and the maritime component was their niche. They were boat operators. They knew what they had to do. They defined a certain geographic area, which is the waterfront, and that's where they worked.
And you even talk about one of the mariners, after dropping off the people in New Jersey, them kind of asking him questions of, well, I've got to get to Hoboken. How do I do that? And him kind of saying, I don't know. My part in this role is to get you from Manhattan to the island, and he just kind of assumed that there were going to be other people, and in most cases there were. There were bartenders there taking care of them. There was decontamination happening, and people that could help them take that second part of the journey to get them home.
And there's really two important things there. One is that this other aspect of the response was evolving at the same time, so they didn't really need to worry about what would happen over in New Jersey or happen over in Brooklyn. Someone else was taking care of that. Right. But also even in Manhattan, that over the course of the day began to develop a little bit more. So initially they would just put people on any boat. They started putting signs on the boat and making a decision. This boat is going to go to Hoboken. This boat is going to go to Liberty Landing. This one's going to go over to Brooklyn. So people could begin making decisions in that way. I checked with you before we started the podcast that this could be a little bit not PG in terms of reading. But there was a fantastic example of two of the people we spoke with who were operating one of the boat. And I'll read their words. I tell it different from him. He tells it different from me. But it's the way I remember it. This like 9-year-old lady comes out of the cloud, just gray covered with a cane. She's like, where are you going? I'm like, Jersey. She replied, Jersey? Fuck that. I ain't going to Jersey. She turned around and walked straight back in. I told her I was going to grab her, the other guy said. She would have whacked you. I don't care. I was going to put her on the boat. And then a New York City cop said, let her go. And I was like, really? She'd rather die than go to New Jersey. Death before New Jersey.
Such a great story.
So, there's lots of examples of that, but even in that case, we have this feeling looking back in time that everything was rushed, everything was tumultuous, and that was certainly the case for many people. But there were also these moments of people making a decision and saying, I don't need to go on that boat. I'm going to find another way. This space of decision making that was occurring even as towers were collapsing around them, and even as people were trying to make sense of what was going on.
And the thing that so struck me, the images you used about talking about how people who are experiencing this via the media, it was just that shot of going into the World Trade Center over and over again, the explosion, the explosion, the explosion. But if you were living in Lower Manhattan, your experience was this murky stillness and silence, and there was this weird calm that gave people the space to make decisions. And I was struck by the stories about the leaders that kind of emerged through this. Like during the day, there were certain people that even in that short span of time grew and became leaders. Like I think Ken Peterson was one that you guys talked about. How did that process happen?
Well, one of the things about Ken Peterson, and we do talk a lot about his experiences in the book, is that not only was he a mariner, but he was also the port captain for the company that he worked for, which means that he's the one who's responsible for making sure that the boats have, they're properly crewed, that they have the right safety equipment, that they're fueled when they need to be, that they meet their schedules. So he's basically the person ashore who makes the fleet work. So he basically became the port captain for this improvised boat operation by filling in that role on the lower part of Manhattan, where he started to direct people toward boats that are going to Staten Island or boats that are going to Hoboken. So as we see in a lot of disasters, people in a disaster setting often fill an analogous role to what they have in their regular lives, because that's where their skills lie and that's where their skills take them.
And that doesn't always have to do with somebody's official rank. People see things getting done and they begin going to that person because they see the decisions that they've made as effective. And over time, that really begins to solidify their leadership role in that way. They don't all have names that we were able to capture. So back at Liberty Landing, there was one woman who was apparently very effective in orchestrating the washdown stations and getting supplies in. But at the same time, no one could quite remember who she was. She just kind of showed up and then left. But she made a memorable impression on many people who looked to her to actually see part of that operation come together so effectively.
It strikes me that there are so many lessons for this, for a response. And one of the things, we were talking to Kathleen Tierney on our last episode, and she made this point that 9/11 changed the emergency management paradigm. And she felt not really in a positive way, that it became much more security focused. And this story, I think, teaches us another direction. It shows us a much more sort of open, sort of populist way that you could manage disasters, and you sort of close the book with that. I want to close or set that up with one more clip.
You couldn't have planned nothing to happen that fast, that quick.
No training. This was just people doing what they had to do that day.
You forget all about what you're supposed to do, what they teach you in school, and you say, you know what, morally, this is the right way to go, and deep down, this is what I'm gonna do.
Average people, they stepped up, and when they needed to.
So if I could read a clip from the book actually along this lines is, not only was there no advanced planning, there was barely any immediate planning. Instead, quote-unquote planning consisted of a not entirely uncontested decision to do something and of a movement to collect the most mutable, durable, and useful tools and equipment available.
So let me just say, are you trying to get us fired? That's basically what I want to know.
There's no need for an emergency planner.
Well, remember, we also teach classes on emergency management and disasters, so I don't think that's exactly the overall take-home message. But that, we often hear, and I'm sure you've heard it and you said it as well, that emergencies involve a process, not a plan. Planning is a process, not an actual document that you're going to stick in a drawer that's 4,000 pages long and no one really remembers what's on page 263 or 892.
892 is my favorite page.
It's
awesome.
awesome.
I enjoy page 892.
But at the same time, it's those conversations, those relationships that you've built through the planning process that are important. It's the fact that New York City was an area that had access to such tremendous amount and variation of resources to draw upon, and people knew people they could call and mobilize and bring that together. So it's not necessarily that we have a rigid document that we follow, but that you've done this work in thinking about scenario X, even if it's routine, even if it's something that you deal with all the time. It's one of the reasons we find that often those social service organizations that have to scrape together money and build relationships routinely are really good in disasters because they're used to being creative and flexible and improvising. That you can involve both strong planning and improvisation, and that it's not a matter of one or the other.
And I think we can take the example of the Coast Guard on 9/11 because the Coast Guard officer Mike Day, he knew that he had top cover from his superior officer to make the best possible decisions, based on the circumstances, that were in existence at that time. He knew that his boss trusted him. So it's not just a question of having a plan, but it's also a question of the professional practice that takes place around the plan. So Mike Day knew that he had top cover. The Coast Guard in general is pretty well integrated into the civilian boating community. Yeah. They do the maritime safety features. They work on harbor safety boards. The Coast Guard Auxiliary is a volunteer component that works with the recreational boating community. So as a government agency, as a military agency, the Coast Guard doesn't just suddenly come in and start doing emergency work. They've been there, and there are these relationships. So it's a question of how plans are implemented, how they're practiced, and how people think about them.
Sometimes we get pushback on discussions related to the incident command system and the mandates associated with that. And one of the things that we're very clear on, it's not that we see no place for the incident command system as an organizing principle, but we also recognize that works really well in incidents or smaller emergencies with organizations that are really used to working with each other and can have a sense of deciding ahead of time who's going to be working together if there's a fire or a wildfire where that whole system developed. When we start looking at something that's much more catastrophic in level, that's much more complex, even people we spoke with who had ICS training from oil spill experience said, yeah, I didn't have time for it that day. Yeah. The reality of people finding things to do and moving along very quickly, knowing each other from that routine interaction, and understanding that that's a possibility as well that can lead for a very successful response.
Boy, relationships are so important in this industry, right? I mean, that's the theme that comes back over and over is the relationships like the Coast Guard had with the maritime community had with each other, even though they were competitors, they trusted each other, they knew each other. And a lot of times it's the relationship that's the key for responding successfully in these things, not necessarily the products of the plans and the procedures that are coming out of it.
Everybody here's read something from the book, so I want to just jump on that bandwagon because
you're feeling some peer
pressure. I know I am. I'm just like everybody else is reading. I want to prove I'm literate. I think I'm literate. I'm not sure. I'm going to see. So here's what you say towards the end of the book. You say, working in a disaster requires some artistry. Getting a community working again after a disaster is an artistic rather than a mechanistic process. As with any art, one employs principles and techniques to create the final work, but handling a disaster is essentially a combination of creative acts by everyone affected. You sort of say, well, this is uncomfortable because people want certainty, but then you quote some folks who argue that important characteristics of reliable performance in a disaster is enacting moments of organized anarchy, which does make me want to form a punk band if you're into that.
That's a good emergency management punk band.
Yeah, in moments of organized
anarchy. When you're done
anarchy.
Your podcast career, you can move on to the.
That's right. We're gonna shave
band.
into a mohawk.
Right.
So I guess talk to me about that. What are the principles you would say are behind this idea of an artistic or a creative, sort of disaster management approach?
Well, part of what we saw in this event and in others is how difficult it is to manage a community. So we talk about emergency management or disaster management, and that's where ICS is relevant. But in ICS, you're not managing the disaster. You're managing organizations. The disaster is something else. The disaster is how people understand the effects. The disaster is what they experience. The disaster is how they've lost their resources and how they try to get those back. So when we talk about the idea of artistry, as with any kind of art, the secret is pulling together different features of the environment, of public assistance or individual assistance or people's insurance or people's capacities for creativity and rebuilding. So it's not a mechanized process, and you can't make a community recover any more effectively than you can make a community function the day before a disaster. Those same forces within the community are still there, even if they're temporarily subordinated or there's a period of good feeling. The community is inherently a complex place that defies planning.
And again, that's one of the reasons why I think from the Coast Guard's perspective, they were so well suited to do what they did in this response. So, they talk about having to make decisions 200 miles off coast in the middle of a storm, coordinating with a fishing boat and trying to orchestrate some sort of rescue. And you can't just call back to headquarters and wait for a decision. You're out there in the midst of it. Yeah. You're seeing the water environment, the weather come at you. You're looking at the vessel. You're making judgment calls, and you kind of have to make a decision to move forward based on that experience, based on those conversations. And that's, again, where that artistry really comes into play.
And the idea that an incident commander, let's say, sitting on, in Manhattan, is going to know what's happening at, Sandy Hook, New Jersey, 17 miles away, as things are unfolding, minute by minute. Nobody is going to be able to apprehend all of that information and somehow process it through their brains and then give rational instructions out into the disaster management organization. It's impossible.
Well, I guess, and I don't know if this is pushback exactly, but the emergency management community spent so much money on situational awareness systems and these ideas that you can create a room through social media, through real-time connections, through, giving people body cams. That's right. Everybody wants it. I love dashboards. Right? No, they're great. No, they're good.
I'll sell you one for $3 million.
Really?
Yes.
I'll take that. That seems worth it, right? Because with a dashboard, you can literally see everything that's going on everywhere, and so you can make perfect decisions about all that. Does that system negate what you're talking about? Does it support your argument? Do you know the trend I'm talking about in emergency management?
Sure. I had an interesting experience a year ago, and I was in London at the Churchill War Rooms, which are basically preserved just as they were at the end of World War II.
Can I just say, I'm sorry, this is totally a tangent, but that is my favorite destination of all time. The map room of the Churchill War Rooms was like the geekiest place that I've ever been.
And when you're looking at those maps, and I was there, and I was thinking, wow, now we've got GIS. Are we really managing things better than we did 75 years ago? When everybody would have said, oh, if we just had GIS, we could manage fabulously. These are not necessarily technical challenges, although we can certainly see them as supported by technology. But these are organizational and philosophical challenges, because as soon as somebody arrives on a disaster scene who isn't part of that smart system, they change it. Everybody who showed up at Atlantic Highlands changed the dynamic of that situation. So there were police officers at Atlantic Highlands who were checking the IDs of everybody coming off the boat, trying to see if they were the terrorists or what they were. Well, that slowed the operation. That wasn't part of the plan. There was no plan. That was improvised. What would that have done to situational awareness? It would have changed it. It would have changed the dynamic of the situation, maybe faster than somebody ashore in Manhattan would have been able to digest that.
And the question is, really, that might help an individual's viewpoint in terms of the dashboard that they are looking at, but there's so many other players who you didn't know yesterday or last week that they were going to be part of this response, and suddenly they are a key player. So I'm thinking back to a really great conversation we had this past summer out in Colorado with this guy, Matt, who him and some other people he was working with developed crowdsourced rescue with the Hurricane Harvey response. And they began matching up where people were saying that they needed assistance and they needed help. They went to bed that night and suddenly their text messaging had lit up, the board had lit up. They didn't know the day before that they would play such a critical role in trying to help coordinate people who were looking to provide assistance and people who were looking to be helped. But that role really evolved over time. So to be welcoming enough in a system to say, this isn't in our situational awareness, people are seeing things that we're not seeing. How can we be flexible enough to pull them into our system and acknowledge that they're doing something really great?
Which we don't want to say that, of course, there's no role for this, obviously, or to be sort of neo-Luddite and say that we had to use strings and pegs like they did in the Churchill war rooms in 1944. But it's just to emphasize, I think, that a lot of what we see is an organizational and not really a technical challenge.
So it's a good segue into the topic of the Cajun Navy, which I think most people are familiar with coming out of Hurricane Harvey and Katrina too, correct?
Sure. What's
the connection with American Dunkirk and the Cajun Navy? Are they related? Is the Cajun Navy an outcropping of what happened on 9/11 in the maritime community?
Not as far as we know. I mean, it's two different groups of people who also saw a need and began responding. I know they were also involved in the Baton Rouge flooding a couple of years ago as well. But even we hear a lot about the Cajun Navy in the news and got a lot of media reports after those events. But there were also a lot of other people who were evacuating people by boat who were not part of any self-identified Cajun Navy operation. It's just, I have a boat, I know where my neighbors are, I'm local to the area, and I'm going to get in and find that person who I know wouldn't have evacuated, who is going to need help. So again, whether or not we're talking about a boat evacuation in New York or along the Gulf Coast, whether we're talking about other types of improvised responses, we see similar movements and similar successful responses in different ways.
All right, I'm an emergency manager. I'm in this new paradigm. I'm trying desperately not to get fired because my job is going to be done by tens of thousands of spontaneous volunteers. What do I do? What are your suggestions for me? Like, how do I plan for this? How do I train for this? What changes in my practice should I undertake to be ready for this world?
Sure. And first, your job is not going to be lost to tens
of thousands. You don't know that, Jim.
No, you don't know. It's not, and we're in the business of teaching people to go into that field. So we're comfortable. But I think that part of the key is, I think we talked about this just before going on the air, was to try to understand how situations are unfolding well, and if they're unfolding well, to let them happen. That there's more to be done in a disaster, sadly, than a government agency can do. That's just the reality. By definition, a disaster affects the entire community. That's why FEMA's talked about the whole community approach. But even on the day-to-day basis in an emergency event, there's more to be done than an agency can do. A lot of the things that volunteers can do and should be doing are things, as Tricia said earlier, anybody can do. You can load a box, you can answer a phone, you can make a list, you can unload a truck. You can do those kinds of things, and that's important disaster work. So part of what we see the role of the emergency manager is as kind of a diplomatic emissary to the disaster site, to find out what's happening, to bring the information back to their office or to the EOC. How can we support what's happening that's going well? What can we leave aside that's going super well, where we don't really need to be? Where are the areas that really need the most assistance, and to sort and prioritize? There is probably some of the, I think, the best role for some of the technologies that you've talked about. But recognize too, I think, that no matter what happens, people are going to try to take care of themselves. When we say that people have to be, ready to be on their own for 72 hours, and actually should even be longer, they're not just going to sit there alone for 72 hours. They're going to start forming emergent groups and self-help, so that by the time emergency managers actually discover them, they've got an organization in place.
Unless they're just playing Fortnite. They
Yeah,
could just be playing Fortnite for 72 straight hours.
But that's only going to last if the electricity's on for a certain amount of time.
That's true. I mean, I do specifically have a generator for my video game system.
Yeah, no, that's important. But the fuel could, it could crap out. You have a real fuel problem.
Some of it's building those relationships ahead of time too. So one of the areas that we often bash our heads against the wall about is the idea of pets and disasters and shelters, and how as an emergency management system we still haven't figured out how to deal with this. We know people are going to delay evacuating if they can't take their pets. We know that they need a place to go. We know that there are going to be issues of not necessarily having the equipment to put in your car and transport long distance. But there's a lot of really sophisticated organizations that have a lot of experience in working with animals, who will happily come in and provide assistance. So rather than saying, no, you can't be involved, to recognize maybe we have other priorities right now, but we have these excellent groups who have knowledge in that area, who could step in. How can we incorporate them into this response ahead of time, or even more so during that response if we haven't built those relationships, so they can help us devote our attention to these other areas where we have, as emergency managers, expertise.
I love this story, and I love it because the world is so tough. I mean, it was tough in 2001. It's tough now. There's so much partisanship, dissension between different factions. And this really, I was so struck again. This is a story where people put it all away. They put their humanity first. They go out there and they work the disaster to help their fellow humans. And that was really, really inspiring.
Yeah, it is such a good book. And I think, the term whole community gets thrown around a lot, and emergency managers don't often know what that means. But your book really dives into what that looks like, and it is a very specific example of a lot of different people with different skills coming together to fix a problem, in a very chaotic scene. So I just encourage every emergency manager to read it, and really every New Yorker too, because that day was so traumatic. But here is a piece of it that doesn't get a lot of attention and a lot of airplay that you really, really bring to light. So thank you for writing it, and appreciate the stories you brought to light.
Which is why we're so sad we now have to hit you with our lightning round. So
we didn't prepare you for this, the lightning round.
No, I think that should be our tradition. We should just never tell people it's coming. We're going to ask you 11 or 12 really quick questions, looking for one-word answers. They're not that embarrassing.
We always say they're one-word answers, but often we get really cool stories coming out of it. So if you have an interesting story.
But wait, we have two people. So what do we alternate, or they both answer each one?
We really should have talked about this. Is good improvisation.
Yeah, I don't know.
Let's just go for it.
We're spontaneously managing. Let's go. Okay, I'll go number one to Tricia. Tricia, what's your favorite hazard?
Jim.
Jim is your favorite hazard.
Immediately phoning a friend.
Maritime hazards.
Oh, look at that. On topic.
That's good. All right, Jim. Who's your favorite disaster sociologist? You can't say yourself or anyone else in the room.
Lee Clark. Mission Improbable.
Oh, that's a great book.
That's a good.
And by the way, they're all my favorite. If any of these sociologists out there are listening, but
Yes.
And if I could jump in,
Yes.
Quarantelli and Dines, two of the key founders of the field. So I think in us doing our due diligence to the co-directors who started the center.
That's right.
So.
That's right. You're the heirs to that those beginnings. What? And I'll go back to Dr. Wachtendorf. What makes you the most nervous? What's the disaster that makes you the most nervous? That you're the most worried about?
I would say really thinking about climate change and the fact that we have regular disasters that we think that we know how to handle, and that how some of the things that we've come to expect and think we've got this covered, looking in 10, 20 years, the environment will have changed, the built environment that we live in has changed. Yeah. So when we think we know something and have to adjust to it.
So Dr. Kendra, what is the first disaster that you remember? Not that you worked necessarily, but the first disaster you remember.
Cape Cod tornado, 1976.
Wow. So what was unique about that?
It was my first.
It was your first.
Very good. Okay, that's fair enough. Back to Dr. Wachtendorf. What's the first major disaster that you worked on or studied?
The 1997 Red River flood. I'm originally from Manitoba, Canada, and so
yeah.
I had just come to UD for grad school and began, hearing information from the U.S. side, and then hearing stuff from the Canadian side from my family, and then realizing that it seemed that the water stopped at the international border.
Yeah.
So looking at the interaction between those two countries.
It's the American force field. We have that, just keeping the water out.
So, Jim, as a mariner, have you ever successfully completed the Texas chicken maneuver?
I have never done the Texas chicken maneuver, either successfully or unsuccessfully.
I'm sorry. Hold on.
And if you don't know what that is, you can.
But have you done it on a video game simulation?
I've done it in simulation.
How did that go?
Successfully.
Oh, good. All right. If you're curious what the Texas chicken maneuver is, as a Texan, I didn't know what it was.
I thought it was a Cowboys thing.
No, you got to read the book.
All right. Back to Tricia. What's the hardest thing about studying disasters?
The fact that we tend to work in these siloed emergency management practice fields, or even for us in academia, looking at sociology or public policy or engineering, and I think we're doing a little bit better of a job of having those interdisciplinary conversations, but repeating the same studies over and over again, rather than thinking about how we work together across disciplines, not seeing this practitioner academic divide, to actually move forward on some of the things that we already know how we should be doing them.
That's great. It's a great thing of this book highlights also is a community that has such a role to play in a disaster that probably wasn't engaged enough, pre 9/11 on disaster response issues. For both of you, favorite disaster movie? Doesn't necessarily have to be a disaster movie, but
could be a movie that was a disaster.
The original Poseidon Adventure.
Oh, interesting. I don't think we've gotten that response yet.
The original Poseidon Adventure, if you set aside the some of the technical errors that they make in the capsizing of the ship, is excellent for its portrayal of human behavior, improvisation, shifting leadership, and emergent groups.
This is a weird, random movie, but it's actually World War Z. So even though it's zombies, we often talk about the popular culture of disaster and disaster misconceptions, but there's a lot of things that they actually did really well in looking at how these different organizations play out, thinking about looking outside the box, dispelling a little bit about those myths in that movie. So even though it's zombie apocalypse, there's a lot of things that were done really well in that movie.
Oh, 30-second pitch. Let's have Brad Pitt star in a remake of the Poseidon Adventure right now. Hollywood, call us.
I'd watch it.
Okay, so for both of you, because we just really like to get people into embarrassing situations, who's your favorite FEMA director that you've worked with? They might refuse to answer. I'm not sure.
Can I say two?
Sure.
I'll allow it.
So I think I was really impressed with Craig Fugate, given his really strong acknowledgement of the research community and pulling in those ideas. But harkening back to James Lee Witt and the Project Impact Days, DRC was involved in some of those technical assessments. So that was, I think, a wonderful time to be involved with FEMA and some of the people who are really working on mitigation activities that feeds into a lot of the things that we're still trying to push through today.
I totally agree.
Well said. Well said.
Since I took two.
So the last one, and this can be for both of you, what's your favorite item in your go bag? Or your shelter-in-place bag?
Granola bars.
Oh, okay.
Always have granola bars.
Any particular kind? Do you like the chewy or the crunchy?
The Fiber One oatmeal chocolate chip.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right. Well,
they work really well in research field deployments as well.
Stressful situations.
When you need a little bit of sugar or something like that, to have a granola bar on hand can be life-saving.
And thank you to our sponsors.
That's right.
My battery-powered radio.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I have 3 in the corner over there, actually. Great. Anything that you guys want to talk about the DRC? Anything that's coming up that we should know about?
Need to plug? Any new books?
Well, I think one of the things that we're really excited about the center is that we're growing. So we've have a number of programs. If anybody's looking for a program in disasters, across different departments in sociology, engineering, geography, an awesome interdisciplinary disaster science program. I know that you had Susan Masili, one of our students, on here a couple of weeks ago. hiring in the area, so a bunch of different faculty from across the different departments. So trying to really do that interdisciplinary work and build it into our program and how we interact with students, not just something we talk about, is a great idea.
And so there are positions posted now for this year, and then there'll be for next year as well.
And just say, thank God there are programs like this that when a disaster happens can go in and learn what's happening, document what's happening, so that we can grow as an industry. So.
And you guys, Delaware really is the granddaddy of all this stuff that's happening. So it's good to see you guys vibrant and thriving and really revolutionizing the field once again.
And I think thank God for those practitioners who are willing to engage with researchers. So, any of the quotes that you read in the book, the information that we gleaned, this is because people gave their time to talk to us for an hour, 2 hours. It's because during 9/11, we had people in the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management welcome us into the EOC, allow us to shadow along with them.
We were only perp walked out a couple of times
when they changed the ID system in between. And so that is something that I think sometimes practitioners think, well, how is this going to benefit me in the short term? But the fact that you can be a community 5, 10, 20 years down the road and still be learning those lessons that somebody else had to learn the hard way. We're so thankful for those practitioners who welcome that involvement by researchers.
So when a disaster researcher comes to your door in the thick of an emergency,
let them in.
Perp walk them out. That's what I say.
Lock them out.
let them in. They're whatever they write isn't coming out for 15 years, so we don't have to worry about it.
So pick up the book. It's an incredible.
Right.
We barely scratched the surface of the stories that are in here. It's an incredible read. American Dunkirk is the name of it. And thank you both again for coming down and talking to us. This is
thanks
really
so much.
special.
Thanks. It's been awesome.
So one thing I just want to close with is, just this weekend, they reopened the Cortlandt Street station on the 1 line.
That's right.
Right? It took 17... That's right. It's been 17 years since 9/11, and one of the final pieces of the 9/11 reconstruction just fell back into place.
Yeah.
So we should tell people, give us a call. We still got our number is ringing, actually, surprisingly. So 859-429-2731. People have actually asked us several times to talk more about emergency management academics and the different degrees you can get. So maybe we'll bring our guests back on to talk about that. And we are starting to look for Game of Thrones spoilers now. So if you have those.
Predictions on the upcoming season.
That's right. We would like to get those locked down. So we're on Twitter at Hazard Podcast, and we'll be talking to you.